Hello everybody, I'm Solothalion. If you haven't already, I'd recommend you watch the intro video to the series, which will be linked in the description. It will provide a little bit of my background with the Wings of Fire series and why I'm doing this review in the first place. Without further ado, let's get into it. The first book in the series is the Dragonet Prophecy, and is told from the perspective of Clay, the Mudwing of the titular prophecy. I generally think that the first books in a new arc are the hardest to get right. They often need to introduce characters that we have never seen before, and also properly set up the story and primary conflicts of the arc at the same time. Being not only the introductory book to the arc, but to the entire Wings of Fire series as a whole, the Dragonet Prophecy had a ton of work to do in terms of basic world building and character introductions. At the same time, it still needed to tell a cohesive story, which, for the most part, I think it did. The prologue wastes no time getting into that vital setup. In it, the Great War is introduced by Byrne, and it is also established for at least one of the three possible queens. The Dragonets of the Prophecy are completely unwanted. The prologue also establishes a couple of the tribe's powers, mentioning both the Icewing Breath of Huiter, as well as Byrne's Poison Barb. The Nightwing Guide and Prophecy before the book also talks about these two things, but it being included in the actual story is a much better way to incorporate it. In my opinion, it feels more natural. Now, the big thing that the prologue sets up is Glory's entire story. It shows how the Skywing Egg is lost and gives context as to why Glory is brought in. Glory is probably my favorite character from the first arc, and they introduce one of the big points of her conflict in her story, being her purpose, quite early here. Moving on to the first part of the book, we are properly introduced to our 5 destined heroes. Clay was definitely the best option Tui could have chosen for the perspective character for this book. He deeply cares for all of his friends, which is kind of contagious in a way, making us care for them as well. I also think that Tui establishes each of the Dragonets' personalities well, without making them one-dimensional characters. Generally, as readers, we get to know characters better when we read their perspective book. However, in the Dragonet Prophecy, more than any other book in the series, the 5 characters are actually fleshed out quite a bit before they even get their own book. This comes from Clay's observations and the fun dialogue they have with each other, which also makes you really believe that these characters are friends, even if we don't get to specifically read about them developing that friendship. This friendship is obviously tested when the Guardians decide to kill Glory, and it holds when the Dragonets decide they need to escape in order to prevent that death. One other moment I like from really early on is the Dragonets acting out the story of how the war started. It both grows the Dragonets' personalities and relationships with each other, and also gives even more context as to what the overarching story of the arc is. Clay's growth throughout the first book begins right from the first chapter. Kestrel tells him to channel his inner monster, referencing how he supposedly tried to kill the other Dragonets when he hatched. This overarching plot of Clay trying to figure out who he really is a great part of this book. It's a good establishment of both his own character, as well as his relationship to his friends. The only section that I find a little weird about the first part is how Scarlet just kind of happens to be in the area where Clay and Tsunami escape out of the mountain. It kind of feels a little shoehorned as a way to introduce Scarlet and create a point of conflict, when I feel that there was probably a more natural way to do so. All in all, a fairly minor nitpick though. Clay's arc continues once they are captured by Scarlet and Part 2 begins. Not only does he have Kestrel's voice telling him that he needs to be a monster, he now also has her daughter and Scarlet telling him the same thing. Despite all of that, he never actually succumbs to the call of the arena. Kestrel's daughter Peril is an interesting character, probably one of, if not my favorite characters in the entire series. That being said, in this book, she is definitely at her least interesting. My biggest gripe with this book is how most of the Skywing prison section is just kind of uninteresting, and Peril is a decently large part of that. I understand her position in the plot as a sort of weird simultaneous angel and devil on Clay's shoulder, as well as how important she is in the later books, but my god, there is just so much dialogue between her and Clay. Although a large chunk of the second part is kind of boring to me, there are some really awesome moments sprinkled throughout it. Clay farmed a ton of aura by playing the Dragonets of Destiny song on the wire, and although they get pissy with each other in the next book, the part with Tsunami and Starflight refusing to fight is incredibly heartwarming. I also think that Kestrel is a cool character, and the reveal of her relationship to Peril both makes sense and also makes it even more sad what happens in the epilogue. There are also a ton of moments that happen in the Sky Palace that are important to the arc later. Although dark, killing Gil is a great moment for Tsunami. It is vital for the second book and also establishes Tsunami as someone who holds to the "it's me and my friends or them" kind of worldview. Clay's fireproof skills are also important for their escape of the Sky Palace and come into play a few different times throughout the series. Scarlet, as a character, continues to be a menace for the rest of the arc and even a few books into the second, after Glory melts off half of her face. Speaking of, Rainwing venom becomes a very important part of the story in the latter half of the arc, and Glory's treatment of her venom differing greatly from her tribe is another reason why her story is so interesting. We'll get to that later though. Plus the cool factor of when Glory finally just gets up and melts Scarlet's face off, it just goes incredibly hard. The graphic novel tragically doesn't do it justice though. Part 3 is super interesting to me. The climax of the book obviously occurs during the escape of the Sky Palace, but there's an entire other part left after. I initially thought that the third part being here was weird and made the pacing awkward, but after thinking on it a bit more, I like it. It provides a good setup for the next books, as well as wraps up Clay's personal arc in a really nice way. At this point, almost any scene that deals with Glory's story in one way or another, I'm gonna end up talking about. But her little test that she does for Clay is actually kind of compelling. I think that it's in character for Clay to not specifically think about Glory feeling unwanted when Peril is mentioned as the possible Wings of Fire. As he said himself, he never even thought about Glory being excluded as a part of Peril possibly joining them. I also think that it is perfectly in character for Glory to feel the way that she feels as well, and this moment does a good job of cementing her place among her friends, which makes it even more tragic that it is excluded from the graphic novel. Clay meeting his parents and siblings is the important final step in his arc. Being trapped under the mountain and never learning what Mudwing culture is like is a little rough at first, especially when his mother just ends up not caring about him. It also makes the death of Asha, the Mudwing who got Clay's egg for the Talons of Peace, before the story begins, even sadder as well. When he meets his siblings though, things finally start to make sense. He finally realizes that he is a Bigwings, that he never tried to kill his friends when they were hatching, rather he was there to try and help and care for them. He also has a really touching moment with Reed, reassuring him that he is the right person to care for his other siblings. Unfortunately, this is like the only time we ever get to have a Mudwing perspective character, until the Hybrid Prince releases next year, and is also some of the only Mudwing world building we get in the entire series, which stinks because their culture and tribe is super interesting. Oh well. The epilogue is kind of an insane setup for some of the biggest twists we get in the first arc. We first of all learn that Starflight has been given some instructions, which aren't fully revealed until Book 4, and cause friction between him and the rest of his friends until then. The epilogue also reveals that the Nightwings have some deeper plan unrelated to the Talons of Peace, and that they also have some connection to Blister. Finally, Kestrel is killed here, and it's frankly one of the darkest deaths in the series, especially with the way that Tui describes it. This death is revealed to everyone else in the second book, and after everything that happened in the Sky Palace, it's a little bit heartbreaking. To conclude, the Dragonet Prophecy does quite a good job at establishing the world and the stakes of it. Almost every single moment in this book is important in one way or another, whether in the book itself or in later ones. Clay's own arc in this book is really good, and Tui does a good job of stretching it over the whole book. The other characters in this book, both minor and major, are compelling and have multiple dimensions. Unfortunately, a lot of the second part, the largest, is uninteresting for pages at a time, but is kind of made up for by the moments in between being quite memorable. As a result, the final tier list placement for this book will be B tier. The A and S tiers are reserved for books that are exceptional, and frankly it's pretty difficult for an intro book, and one that needs to do so much setup to get that high. Generally, the payoff will always end up ranking higher than the setup. This book is still quite good though, and I imagine it'll be ahead of some of the other books that I think will end up in this tier. That is going to do it for this review. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I put a lot of time into this and would love feedback, as well as your own opinions on the first book in the comments. The next book will be The Lost Heir, one that I initially had a poor opinion of going into it. Did that change? You'll find out in the next episode. Have a good one.